housekeeping. So I'm just really excited about today. The talk, of course, is about pulp science fiction magazines, and we have three experts on the subject, so it's a great panel. I am very excited about the people attending. Is a lot of people who know us and we know and have relationships with at different institutions or here. But I also see a very international crowd: Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Czech Republic, Germany, Canada, you name it. So thank you everybody for really taking the time and participating today. And again, if you want the recording, just send me an email and I'll send you the link. And down the line, we hope to put all of our talks on the web. We haven't done it yet, but it's gonna happen. So I'm gonna introduce everybody because we have a pretty full program. So this is one of our what we call mirror talks that we started this year. Is an idea I got last year, and we've been working on setting up a program. And we love to collaborate at the Cushing Library here at Texas A&M. And so I started working with other institutions. We had a few weeks ago a talk with the General Land Office in Austin and one of my colleagues here at A&M about maps. And this is our second talk, and is about a great topic that clearly raises a lot of interest. So again, we are going to do more of this. So we'll have panels and we'll have talks about topics that we all work on in our institutions, and also collections that are similar or items that are the same. So it's a mirror talk because we're talking about things that kind of we share and we have across institutions. So I'm going to start introducing our guest. First of all, Anna Culberson. She's the head of special collections and university archives at San Diego State University, and she's a librarian specializing in rare books and special collections. She curates the department's speculative fiction and zines and mini comics collections, and researches the history of the book, graphic design, and material culture. Also, feminist science fiction, comics, and zines, history of witchcraft, and new religious movements. So a very broad interest. Andrew Lippert is a special collections processing archivist at the University of California, Riverside. In his role, he reviews and prepares manuscript collections for research use and writes and updates finding aids for the collections. He has a background in history and enjoys incorporating this into his professional work through the study of archival history and theory. Andrew is also a lifelong science fiction fan and greatly enjoys working with the Eaton Collection of Science Fiction and Fantasy. And last but not least, my colleague Jeremy Burke, who's associate professor at the Cushing Memorial Library and Archives here at Texas A&M University. And he is a processing archivist and the curator of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Collection. He has also worked at the University of Iowa, at Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the National Archives and Records Administration Pacific Region, and also the Wisconsin Historical Society. He received his MLS and MA in history from the University of Maryland, College Park, and his professional interests include science fiction, fan studies, and the intersection of libraries and social justice. And before we start, I also want to acknowledge Hal Hall is in the audience, is one of our great colleagues, and he really kind of started the collection and built it up and made it what it is today. So Hal, thank you for being here and thank you for everything you've done. So Jeremy, is now your floor, and I will be quiet.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you all for coming today. On behalf of Cushing Library, Texas A&M, and Andrew and Anna, and all the ships at sea, we want to thank you all for coming and taking the time to be here today. I know for some of you, this time may be inconvenient because we have people from all over the place. But we're gratified that enough people are taking interest in this subject that they've come to spend an hour with us today. Before we get started, Francesca was kind enough to introduce us all. We just want to speak very briefly, each of us, about what collections we curate, and just in slightly more detail so you have some context. As Francesca said, I'm curator of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Research Collection here at A&M. This collection was started in the mid-1970s by Hal Hall, who Francesca also mentioned, our first curator, who is here in the virtual audience. That collection has grown over the last 40-odd years from a small collection of science fiction paperbacks found that Hal discovered an ad in the back of the magazine, to one of the largest collections of its kind in the world, with thousands upon thousands, need to get an accurate count for my catalog, books, scholarly journals, pulp magazines that we're talking about today, objects, artwork, archival collections, all manner of things. It kind of reflects the history, the oddball history of the genre. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So Anna, you want to talk a little bit about your collection?
Yeah, sorry, I was admitting a few people in from the waiting room. Hi, yeah, so I'm Anna Culbertson, joining you today from San Diego State University, which I want to mention sits on unceded Kumeyaay land. Our science fiction collection was launched with the acquisition of the personal library of SDSU English Lit professor Elizabeth Chater, who was also an author in the late 1970s. We've since acquired an exceptional collection of Golden Age science fiction from Edward E. Marsh and the Library of Literary Editor and Critic Larry McCaffrey, who helped put cyberpunk on the map of postmodernist literature. And we collect in all aspects of speculative fiction and the comic arts. So we have extensive runs of many rare pulp magazines and comics, vintage paperbacks, fanzines, tons of first editions, archival collections, and a variety of art, toys, figurines, ephemera, things like that. I also just want to mention right now that I'm going to be showing some racist and sexist imagery that is offensive and potentially harmful. So if anyone feels the need to look away during my portion, I encourage that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'm Andrew Lippert, Special Collections Processing Archivist at UC Riverside. I work pretty extensively with the Eaton Collection. And I guess I don't have too much more to say. The Eaton Collection sounds, in summary, a lot like what Anna and Jeremy work with. I can say we have a pretty extensive fan collection, both from individual, like archival collections from individual people, and also just a broader fanzine collection. We also have a very extensive print collection of paperbacks and hardbacks across several languages. Your traditional AV media, it's pretty extensive, a lot of action figures and ephemera and realia and objects and collectibles and a lot of that. And we try to collect authors' papers as much as we can. So yeah, sounds pretty similar, but we all have, our own unique little slice of the broader genre pie, I suppose. So with that, I will pass it back to Jeremy.
Thanks, guys. Andrew's being modest, by the way. The Eaton Collection Riverside is actually the largest of its kind in the entire world, but he's very modest not to say that, so we'll say it for him. So today our mirror talk is going to be about pulp magazines, and more specifically, with a couple of exceptions, we're going to talk about amazing stories, the runs of which are held by all three of our institutions. We're going to essentially take a pulp and a pulp magazine and the concept pulp magazines and animatize it. Now, like this guy is being animatized, so perhaps not quite as horribly violent as this poor fellow seems to be getting shoved into his death ray. I like the way his pants are still intact, no matter what is going on above it on his torso. So why do institutions like ourselves collect pulp magazines? Why are they so valuable as research materials? Anna's going to talk a little bit more as we get into it, some of the research potential in pulp magazines. But just briefly to say that pulp magazines are integral to the development of American science fiction fantasy. And from that, because of the influence of the United States on the Western science fiction fantasy genres, to the Western concept of the genres as a whole. They've provided plots, they provided tropes, they provided imagery that affects science fiction and fantasy to this day, even after the post-war new wave kind of took precedence. The pulp influences, even after the pulp magazines started dying out in the late 40s and 50s, that influence, that imagery, that kind of influence passed on into radio shows, into television, into films, and into comic books, and they still exercise that kind of influence today. Pulp magazines help set the boundaries and expectations for literary subgenres such as science fiction, fantasy, mystery, things like that. With things like with features such as melodrama, the punchiness of plots, punchiness of action, less emphasis on character development, more on hard-driving plots, imagery that borders or sometimes crosses over the border into luridness at times. So this is all kind of a long-lasting cultural influences that pulps have on American popular and material culture. Versus being streperous. Science fiction historian Neil Barron, and this is like a very, very quick summary. Science fiction historian Neil Barron writes what we call pulp romance, romance in the traditional literary sense. Kind of began with the publisher and editor Frank Munsey, who has published several important magazines such as Argosy and All Story, with two were later combined into one magazine. In 1912, Munsey published in the All Story the story Under the Moons of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This was the first story featuring the character John Carter. Carter, as some of you may know, is a legendary figure in pulp history, an ex-Confederate soldier who's transported to Mars, where he engages on this long series of very colorful, dramatic adventures. So in Burroughs's oeuvre and to the people around him kind of mark a transfer in the popular image of science fiction and fantasy from its British and French origins, people like Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, those kind of early founders of the genre, to a new kind of particularly American innovation, a literary aesthetic that showcases plot and incident over character development, as I said, featuring daring do, featuring exotic locales, escapism, action, focus on adventure, as opposed to a focus on more thoughtful kind of plottings and with sort of with social commentary, the kind that Wells was doing. These pulps kind of bridge the gap between the 19th century dime novels, which were popular, the cheap popular literature of the time, and the mid-20th century cheap paperback fiction, which really starts evolving in the 50s. Pulps are kind of a natural bridge in that area. What is a pulp? I put this one up because this is one of my favorite covers. It's like, I have a little dog and a little bubble. I can't get over this. I haven't read the stories. I have no idea what's going on, but that is cool. So a pulp magazine is, it's called that because it's printed on very cheap, highly acidic wood pulp paper. Those of you who dealt with physical pulps anyway will know that if you look at them wrong, they start exploding into heaps of dust. Up until the mid 19th century, most paper would be made from cotton rags. But once literacy rates in the mid 19th century start going up, people want more books, and they want more newspapers, they want more magazines. Cotton rag supply is not going to get it done, so they developed a process to get paper out of trees, out of wood pulp, which is great because trees are fairly plentiful. But the problem is the wood pulp is very acidic. So it's very friable. It kind of starts disintegrating like as soon as it touches air. Those of you who've gone into an old library, used bookstore, that kind of smell you get that kind of common to those institutions. A lot of that is dust. Some of that is mildew. A lot of what you're smelling though, you're actually smelling the acid eating away at the paper. So, which I know is kind of depressing to think about, but there it is. Pulps were designed initially, actually, to sort of escape existing postal laws. To be considered second-class mail, an article had to be a publication had to be formed of printed sheets, but not contain any board, cloth, leather, or any sort of substantial binding, as a printed book would have. So to manage to only pay second-class mail and make it cheaper to send out, because pulps originally were distributed mostly through the mail rather than on the newsstand, the magazine publishers made them bigger, made them longer, made them way cheaper on a cheap paper. And so, boom, that's how pulp magazines were born. They're highly disposable, both in construction, very cheap, and in content, right? These were meant to be read essentially and thrown away. 25 cents, 35 cents a copy. You get a lot of great stuff in there, but these were not really, they're kind of like early comic books, not really designed to be permanent items. And as I say, most were bought in newsstands. As time went on, subscription kind of died out. Most pulp tend to be bought in newsstands. So genres, first subgenres, as we understand them, really find their popularity in pulps. The original pulp eclecticism, pulps originally started out, you had all kinds of different stories in a pulp. But you start getting into genre specialization as publishers and editors start to see popularity of certain kinds of stories go up and down. You start tailoring individual titles to those particular subjects. So you get horror, and you get Western, and you get crime, and you get mystery, and you get romance, and you get war, and you get sports, and you get whatever the heck is going on here. Woman being attacked by monkeys, which is probably some sort of, not very popular subgenre. I don't know. But the gist of this is pulps are cheap, so they are within easy reach of lower, middle, and lower classes. At the end of World War I, there are about 24 pulp titles on the newsstand. By the middle of the Great Depression, you're starting to get over 200 titles in print because of this. Some people's available income went down. This is a reasonably cheap way to spread literature to the masses. Publication is frequent, usually published once a month. The covers are lurid often and colorful and they're flashy. That catches the eye then as it does now. And so genre specialization causes these number of pulps to just completely explode.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeremy. I think that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about today, which is that no examination of pulp fiction as material culture would be complete without a critical look at the problematic stereotypes that persisted, both in text and image, particularly in the first half of the 20th century. Because pulp magazines are artifacts of American culture, they embody the ideology and attitudes that were prevalent in the US in their respective periods. The earliest magazines that were devoted purely to science fiction emerged in the decade after World War I. So they reflected a society deeply immersed in patriotism, but also the Great Depression, fear, and paranoia. Since World War II came only 2 decades later, the first half of the 20th century was marked by a collective psyche that spanned generations. But the content by no means was purely consequential either. The Office of War Information designated magazines as propaganda machines and distributed content guides geared to the target audiences of specific titles. So the stories and advertising were strategic. You end up with these magazines that are steeped in ideology of Western imperialism, xenophobia, racism, and sexism. I was actually reading a bunch of rhetoric on Twitter this morning about how systemic racism is a myth and thinking to myself, but you can literally dig through this publishing history and excavate that. So we mustn't fall victim to this divisive gaslighting that's going on right now. But anyway, there's already, not surprisingly, a large body of literature on the subject, so I'm not going to go into deep analytic detail, but I will provide a brief survey of what I mean by problematic stereotypes. Slide, Jeremy. So the first one is hypermasculinity, attributable almost exclusively to the white American or British man, who is usually the protagonist. Descriptions of these characters are brief and mostly flattering. You have courageous, lanky and blonde, handsome face, muscular build, and so on. And other European men are described with slight physical inferiority, but nonetheless complimentary terms. But what I find intriguing about the hypermasculine hero stereotype found in the stories is that the advertising that accompanies them does its part as well. So you can see from the slide here that magazines did their part to build these strong, handsome heroes. As I go through the next few slides, you're going to notice a difference, though, in how authors describe the bodies of women and people of color. While relative to their roles in the stories, whether as secondary characters, villains, or plot devices, I find that there's a very clear othering of bodies going on. Slide, please. Jeremy, can you change the slide? Oh, sorry. Okay. The yellow peril phenomenon developed in the late 19th century. Oh, sorry, go back one. My mistake. Okay, sorry. The yellow peril phenomenon that developed in the late 19th century was a response to the expansion of the Western Empire and how East Asians were perceived as an existential threat to global prosperity. Its roots probably lie in the residual fear Europe felt after reckoning with Genghis Khan, but also the labor threat posed by Chinese immigrants to the West who were willing to work for less pay, the Boxer Rebellion, and the military power of Imperial Japan. So Asian characters in early 20th century pulp short stories, genre novels, and comics were horrifyingly racist. The Asian supervillain archetype, best exemplified by Sax Rohmer's Dr. Fu Manchu, appeared constantly constantly in magazines like the Phantom Div and Weird Tales. Weird Tales is notoriously bad for this. Descriptions of Asian men in these stories emphasize inexplicably sinister facial attributes, lack of humanity, and cold lifelessness. I've got a whole bunch of text on the screen, and I apologize if I'm going through it too fast, but I'm more than happy to share these slides out. Okay. Next slide, please. Other people of color were more or less lumped together as savage or dim-witted or mysterious con artists with ulterior motives, like the enigmatic genie stereotype for men or the seductive belly dancer woman. Imagery of men as intimidating and barbaric or unflattering, depicting bent, slobbish, pathetic characters with ghoulish features. Descriptions of men's faces, again, somehow mirror their black hearts, as you can see in some of the text on the screen. And women of color, on the other hand, are exoticized and coveted wild animals to be tamed, but not trusted. Next slide. Women received a bit more multidimensionality in that they could be white or exotic damsels in distress, exotic enemies turned good by their attraction to the protagonist, or evil villains suspiciously reminiscent of the feminist movement. Women's bodies were always described in what seems like twice the amount of detail, with special emphasis on their weight and their sex appeal. And the male characters in the stories speak liberally to women, informing them of their physical flaws and other details not at all germane to their role in the stories. The Cult of the Witch Queen from Amazing Stories, August 1946, fascinates me as a prophetic glimpse of the backlash that would accompany the women's liberation movement a few decades later, with seeming references to birth control and bodily autonomy. Okay, next slide. It's worth noting that although the Amazing Stories issues that we're looking at today do contain offensive content, I find that it's less obvious on its face than some of the more lurid, sensationalist titles I showed earlier, where the racism pretty much screams at you from the front cover. Amazing Stories tends to stick to illustrations of aliens, technology, spaceships, and there's a distinct current running between the three issues we're examining together. Given their dates should come as no surprise, and that's Western imperialism, Red Scare paranoia, and the space race. The August 1928 issue contains a near-apocalyptic Yellow Peril story about the Mongolian Empire approaching global domination, with Americans having retreated to the forest to hide and strategize. The author describes Americans as a hunted race in their own land, which of course is also reflecting a lack of acknowledgement of the indigenous tribes that they displaced. There's also a charming ad for beauty secrets directed at women, which is suggestive of female readership, which I thought was really interesting. Next slide. Again, in the March 1939 issue, we see less direct racial slurs and more allegory about the Soviet threat, the space race, and nuclear development, as in Valley of Invisible Men, but with descriptions of alien encounters suggestive of people of color. There's also a charming ad for a series of books on love and beauty around the world, which is presented in what seems like a form of amateur anthropological interest, but it's undoubtedly exploitative in content. It reminds me of when we were young and we used to pass around National Geographic magazines. Next slide. The star of the March 1945 issue for me is The Martian's Masterpiece. This is an odd anti-feminist warning to women who pursue work outside of the household. There's the commonly seen Charles Atlas ad geared towards bodybuilding, a typical Western-esque story that features Latin Americans speaking in broken English, and a bizarre pseudoscientific op-ed featuring the author's theories on the distribution across the Americas after the Ice Age. Scientific racism in the pulps is something that I'm suddenly finding myself interested in and want to look further into. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to, I believe, Andrew to riff some more.
Let me just, I have one like transition slide. Then we'll go to.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so thank you, Anna. So Anna has been talking about a bunch of different pulps, but you'll notice she focused a lot on amazing stories, as Andrew is about to do, as I'm about to do. So why are we focusing on amazing stories, given my earlier statistic that there were over 200 pulps in the mid-1930s? We picked amazing stories because it's foundational to the genre. Amazing stories has been running almost continuously since 1926. These images here on the left is a image of the very first issue of April 1926. The second one is when Amazing was kind of reducible in a digest form in 1975, and the one on the right is from the 2020. This is just an issue from last year. It is continued under different editors, under variations in titles, and if you're a serials cataloger out there, the title changes are ridiculously confusing. So I apologize to all the catalogers everywhere on behalf of the pulp industry. So Amazing is the foundational science fiction pulp. It's the first pulp magazine to deal exclusively with science fiction, and it would lead the way for other important titles and a lot more important venues for authors both great and small. Titles like Astounding, Galaxy, Planet, Wonder, things like that. It was founded by Hugo Gernsback, a publisher who had been publishing nonfiction magazines up until 1926, The Experimenter and The Electrical Experimenter, which were primarily nonfiction venues for exploring scientific developments. He did start including fiction stories there in the mid-1920s, and Amazing Stories he moved to an all-fiction format for science fiction. He's sometimes credited with coining the term science fiction, although he originally called it scientific fiction, all one word. But that quickly fell out of favor as he realized that is really not easy to say. It's not very intuitive in some scientific fiction. And Gernsback was known, at least in the early days, Amazing Stories was known for insisting on stories that were grounded in real life scientific principles, because he was viewing his work not only as entertainment, but having an educational aspect as well. Enjoy our cool animation there while Andy goes to.
Yeah, so I love doing these things, these events like this, because it's just wonderful to hear, you know, even as a presenter, right? Like I get to sit and listen to Anna and Jeremy talk as well. And you know, anytime you do something like this, you always learn something from your co-presenters as well. So it's just great. I'm having a great time even just sitting here listening to you two talk. But so we've gotten a pretty good background on you know, pulps in general and sort of you know, the 30,000 foot view of it from Anna. I want to dive in, sort of zoom in a little bit on a couple specific aspects to the pulps, specifically Amazing Stories. And first I want to talk about the letter columns here, as you can see on this slide. So the pulps created a space that really allowed fans to interact with each other on a wider scale than whatever local fan club might have been in their area at the time. Especially, you know, the farther back you go, the more isolated people and groups tended to be. You know, communication was just harder and slower. In particular, the letter columns of the pulps fostered early fandom and allowed it to become a wider community. It also provided a space in which authors and fans could interact to a point. It's not extensive, but you do find a little bit. And in many ways, we can think of the pulp letter columns and the fanzines too, as part of a longer tradition of community engagement that originated in these letter columns and then migrated many decades later. You know, you see the convention movement, and then you a few decades after that, right, when the internet comes along, you start to see these conversations migrate to online forums and message boards and blogs, and you know, in the 90s and the early 2000s. And now it's moved into various social media spaces. And these letter columns really demonstrate this fan engagement, a budding community. And I really think that the letter columns in the pulp specifically are instrumental, one of the instrumental components that led towards an explosion of convention engagement in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which has really only gained steam into the modern era. So on this first slide here, I wanted to just give you an idea of what was going on in some of these letter columns. And on the left-hand side, we have Amazing Stories 1928. And there's two letters here. The one on the left is nice and short, and it's a full example of the letter with the response from the editor. The one on the right is an excerpt. This was like, I think it took up almost the entire page of the letter columns. And there was a third one on the same theme here, talking about the perspective of a traveler traveling in a ship faster than the speed of light or near the speed of light. And this is in 1928, so we're a couple decades after Einstein and theory of relativity. So this is all still very new. And it just, to me, it exemplifies in many ways the kinds of, that just sort of nerd club talk of that has always been a part of science fiction. And I particularly like on the second of those two towards the bottom, I have a little yellow highlight down there. He was even including sort of mathematical equations, right? Like that's how into the weeds and into the minutia, right, these sort of conversations are. So it was just really fascinating just to see, right, you're seeing people engaging with the stories and responding to them, and there's a wider discussion going on, and it carries over from issue to issue. Sometimes you can have really long conversations or discussions with many participants that go over a number of different issues, which I just find fascinating. In the middle here, we have another example. You can see there's a great photograph there of L. Sprague de Camp. That's actually from the Klein, the J.K. Klein photographs, which are at UC Riverside in the Eaton collection. But there's a great little blurb here from de Camp, who even him as an author, who was pretty well known, in the early period. He's getting into it too, right? He's sort of chastising the editors for fiddling with somebody's stories, which I just thought was great. And it's just evidence of, right, it's not just fans, it's not just people who are picking up these fanzines on their newsstand or through a subscription. The authors themselves were engaging, and obviously he was a reader, right? It's not just that he's writing a story and sending it off and who cares what happens. He's actually reading the magazines too. And this is just one example, but there are a number of examples as well of people authors in their youth who were part of this community, as teenagers or as young individuals who were engaging, right, with the community, writing letters, reading the stories, who then went on themselves to become pretty well-known, award-winning, pillars of the community. So it's sort of a two-way street in a way. And the second one here next to the de Camp is one that particularly caught my eye. That reminds me of a lot of conversations that I had with some of my buddies when I was younger, right? Just the idea of, okay, we have a death ray, but a death ray is totally impractical, right? Like you can't possibly carry around the amount of energy that you would need to use a death ray to this effect, right? And it's just sort of the group of us were talking yesterday, sort of prepping for this, and Jeremy brought up those conversations, you have as a kid talking about, well, what happens if the Hulk punches Superman? These kind of questions, or do you like Batman or do you like Superman? Who would win in a fight, right? And we see these still happening today, right? There was just a couple of years ago, one of the DC movies was a big fight between Batman and Superman. So, right, there's just all this sort of fiddling over, inconsequential little minutia. It's showing this sort of interest and engagement in the science and the technology and the practicality of what's going on in these stories, which is just always interesting. And again, another one on the right-hand side here is sort of in line with that the first set from 1928. But this is, almost 20 years later, talking again about this sort of relativistic speed of light problem, right? It's not intuitive, it's not common. I just thought it was really interesting. He's not so much talking about the speed of light, but he's using the speed of light to talk about time travel, right? People are just always interested in how you might travel through time. And I don't know, I think this is kind of amusing. I don't know that it's particularly scientifically accurate, but I thought it was really sort of another emblematic example of the kind of technological conversations that we're having, or the discussions that people are having over some of the content that's going on in these stories. Slide, please, Jeremy. So I don't think you can really talk about the pulps without talking about some of the different editorial eras and the people who were involved with creating the pulps. Jeremy mentioned Hugo Gernsback, right? He was a very influential figure. Campbell, again, he's another different title, but he was another really influential figure. And I don't think you can talk about amazing stories without getting into the Ray Palmer can of worms a little bit. So Ray Palmer took over as the editor with the June 1938 issue, and he held that role until the end of 1949. And from his first issue to the end of his publishing and editing career, Palmer delved into and encouraged conspiracies, the unexplained, and the mystical. His first issue of Amazing Stories included the rather bold statement on the cover of, quote, "every story scientifically accurate." And that was in big print right along the bottom. You know, from side to side, it just covered the whole bottom of the issue, which would prove to be rather ironic through his editorship, as we will explore here in a moment. He was one of the driving forces behind the Schaefer hoax in the mid-40s. He promoted numerous New Age and pseudo-religious movements, and he regularly published letters with outlandish and unexplained stories and events. And he is often seen encouraging these wild claims through the comments from the editor in the letter columns. And I don't think I may have mentioned this on the last slide, but pretty much every letter had some kind of response or rebuttal from the editor in italics below. So nothing made it in without the editor having his 2 cents, right? So a few examples here. We've branched out a little bit from the specific issues that we were focusing on, but I really wanted to sort of pull in some of this just weirdness that is more emblematic of Palmer's tenure as editor. So on the left, with Palmer, you start to see ads like this one on the left for the Rosicrucians, and this is a really odd group. There's not a ton of information about this organization. There were some letters from like the secretary of the Rosicrucians, which I thought were interesting. But these ads start to show up with some regularity. And they're always tantalizing the reader with some kind of secret powers or hidden truths and some vague, mysterious doctrine that is supposed to, be like some unifying theory that'll explain the universe to, if you join their group. And what information we do have out there, it's almost like a secret society, like the Freemasons, kind of, sort of. And it has its roots in the early modern period and was part of this mystical Hermetic tradition. But Palmer in particular seems very inclined towards these mystical New Age or quasi-religious, even cult-like organizations. And this is just one example. There are, the Rosicrucian ads, they were buying full page ads pretty regularly, but there were other groups too that were finding their way in during Palmer's tenure as editor. Another good example of sort of this weird paranormal unexplained phenomenon is this excerpt in the middle here, which is from the letter columns again. And this one, it doesn't show back and forth, right? This isn't that community engagement, conversation, discussion that's happening. This is more people would just send in weird experiences that they had, and Palmer was happy to put them in. And so this guy, the reader here, or the writer here, recounts an odd dream that he had while he was sick with the measles, which, first off, probably fever-induced dreams would be my guess. But then he goes on to describe what he calls a rocket ship, which he found while hiking in the Poconos. And I'm just going to go ahead and read this description here because it's just fantastic. This is the highlighted section for anybody who wants to read along. If it be a rocket ship, I can think of no other words to employ. It differs from Mr. VG's observation in San Francisco Bay. It was not heavy, but light, or at least that was the impression obtained from my handling of the door. It was at most as heavy as aluminum, but more durable, more resistant to wear. The impact that buried it in the soil had not dented the apparently monocoque type fuselage. There were no seams or rivets visible as I recall. The metallic luster I simply cannot explain. I have heard that there are alloys of gold and iron which have a bluish tinge, but there exists no other analogy to its coloration. And it's just, right, to me, it's just very evocative of just the beginning of the UFO phenomenon. Which Palmer was a big player in. So this happened right around this happened right before the Roswell incidents, and Palmer went on to start paranormal magazines, and he was really one of the impetus behind the modern UFO phenomenon, which, again, it's just, wherever Palmer goes, you find more of this sort of interest in the paranormal or the pseudoscientific. And the last example here on the right, it fits in a little bit with the Rosicrucians. So he pursued this quasi-religious organization through this text of the OAHSPE, which proclaimed to contain new revelations from the 19th century. And he was so enamored with this text and the organization itself that in the 1960s, after a number of years looking for an original edition from 1882, he actually went back and republished it. And he did numerous editions of this text as well. And I think this is just, it's just emblematic of how like down the rabbit hole Palmer got with some of this stuff. And it's not just that he was looking for controversial things. He truly himself got down in the weeds, and he was, you know, what I would think, I think we can call probably a true believer in some of this stuff. And it just, right, it's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to dive into with Palmer, but I'm going to pass it back to whoever's up next. I can't remember which one.
Well, I just wanted to mention, going off of that, the ads that were in those early magazines, I don't know if they were a precursor to, or if they were influential, or if it happened to have been happening simultaneously, but a lot of the science fiction authors in the 40s and 50s were getting really into like the Western esoteric tradition and occult magic. And I'm reminded of, you know, the relationship that L. Ron Hubbard had with Jack Parsons, who blew himself up. You know, and they got together and did all this like chaos magic practice stuff. So I think there's a very interesting link between science fiction and early alternative religion, which we also happen to have a really cool collection of at San Diego State. So it's definitely reflective of the fan culture and the material culture that science fiction folks were participating in at the time.
Yeah, the pulps seem to be, and fandom in general seems to just be sort of fertile ground for some of this, which, I mean, if you go and start looking in the actual like fandom documents, right, in the 50s or even the late 40s, you start looking at the fanzines and some of that other stuff, you don't find so much of it. People are more interested in just, right, they're interested in going to conventions and writing about their experiences and doing cosplay and some of that kind of stuff, and just your generic community type thing. And you don't see so much of that fringe element in the actual fan produced works, right? At least I haven't. And it sort of raises more questions, and it's sort of interesting avenues of potential research, right? Which again speaks to like, why do we have this stuff in the first place? Like, sure, there's this sort of nostalgic or artifactual value, but there's also this very interesting, as soon as you start like getting into them and you look beyond just the cover, or you start actually, you look sort of between the lines and you're not just reading the stories, you start to see these weird themes or these weird common elements across the industry. Yeah, it just raises so many questions. And right, so it's sort of, that's another element of why we like to keep this stuff, and why we're devoting so much time and energy and space to it.
There's almost too much.
Yeah.
There's no almost, there's too much. Yeah, so thanks Andrew, thanks Anna. Going on, I want to leave, hopefully we'll leave a few minutes for questions. I'm going to try and go quickly through the rest of it. So talking about the literary, amazing story, as Andrew mentioned, nostalgia. So the Pulps do have, and Amazing Stories in particular, has this sort of nostalgic phase around, like full of these wonderful stories of high quality and by up and coming names who are now legends in the genre, and a lot of that is true. In fact, we semi-focused on 3 particular issues of Amazing Stories to make that point. So this you saw before in Anna's presentation, in Anna's portion of the presentation. This is a cover from the August 1928 issue of Amazing Stories. It's famous. It has 2 pivotal stories in it. The first is the one that Anna already talked about, Armageddon 2419 AD, a very zingy sort of name. This is the story about a man who, who falls into a mine with a strange radioactive gas. The gas throws him into Spain animation, and he wakes up 500 years later into this North America is under occupation by the Hans, or the Chinese, and Americans, Americans are forced to go hide in the woods and launch guerrilla warfare. So this is an important story because the name of the man, the name of the character, the narrator is Anthony Rogers. In 1929, he sort of rebooted in a comic strip with a new first name, the new first name of Buck. So this is considered the first appearance by the character Buck Rogers, who was so influential in serials and in fiction later. The other one, this is the first illustration from the cover story, Skylark of Space by E. Doc Smith. Skylark of Space is considered the first example in the popular subgenre of the space opera. Space opera is characterized by lots of hard-driving action, by space fleets fighting interplanetary wars. Vast distances are involved across galaxies, not just planets. Immensely powerful technologies being put to work. And space opera, of course, has had an immense cultural influence in the United States and elsewhere. Particularly, the most obvious current outgrowth of space opera is, of course, Star Wars. That's very George Lucas was drawing very deliberately on these kind of tropes. The March 1939 issue of Amazing, which is another one we sort of focus on here, features this story, Marooned Off Vestas. This is the first published story by Isaac Asimov. It's a fairly simple story. 3 astronauts whose ship is damaged. They're facing a certain death in space following catastrophic damage to their spaceship. And how they use scientific principles and the things around them to escape their predicament. So it's a story vested very heavily in scientific principles. That's very typical, not only of Isaac Asimov's productions, but also of the type of scientifically backed material that Hugo Gernsback favored, an Amazing published a lot of, certainly in its early days. This is the table of contents for the March 1945 issue, the 3rd one we dealt with. This is important because it is the first story there. I Remember Lemuria is the first story by Richard Schaefer. The Schaefer mystery, which was championed by Ray Palmer, what Andrew was talking about before, the sort of introduction of this very sort of pseudo-scientific at best kind of strand in the genre. The Schaefer mystery stories being concerned with, like, there's a hollow earth and there's these people living underneath it and they have this entire civilization, and they're trying to pass it off as fact where it's obviously not, that kind of thing. But I think it's also interesting, this table of content is interesting for showing the idea that the content of these stories is variable. Remember Theodore Sturgeon's famous line that 90% of everything is crap. Well, the Pulps kind of reflect that too, for all the nostalgic haze around this being the place where people like Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke and all these other great writers, and H.P. Lovecraft, all these other great writers get their start. It's also a place where a lot of writers who are not that great also, and are not heard from again after 1 or 2 stories, also make their debut. And the variety in stories is also deceptive. So just looking at this particular table of contents, right? You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you've got 9 stories there, some of which have, I love Dr. McIndoe's Encephalosomatic Communicator. That title, zing, man. But what's interesting is if you look at these 9 people, it's deceptive. So Leroy Xerxa there, who wrote The Lying Lie Detector. The illustrator is also Lee Francis, who wrote Common from Yesterday. He is also Richard Casey, who wrote Valley of Delirium. He is also Alexander Blade, who wrote Is This the Night? So one guy is under different names, responsible for 4 stories in that. Sergeant Morris J. Steele at the top there. That's actually a pseudonym for Ray Palmer, the editor Andrew talked about. So really, when you think you're getting this sort of rich banquet in March 1945 of stories, you're really getting a very few voices that are just speaking under different names and writing sort of a different subject. So that's kind of interesting take on the publishing industry. I just want to close really quickly talking about a couple more ads. I bring these ads up because different kind of advertisements, because we've had students who talk about the pulps and they comment on the prevalence of these. So I want to talk about them a little bit. One notable aspect of pulps in this era is a high percentage of advertisements devoted to self-education and correspondence schools, kind of distance learning that really got popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These sort of opportunities allow for the possibility of vocational education for people, especially in lower and middle classes, as well as for people who might be unable to reach larger cities where universities and night schools will be primarily located. Especially after post-World War I, you start seeing schools trying to capitalize on the need for jobs in emerging fields of radio and electronics or electricity. So these ads here are from the National Radio Institute, which was a correspondence school started in 1914. 1923 became exclusively correspondence-based. This ad's from 1928. Equipment would be sent to students through the mail for kits. They would work on them, assignments, they'd mail them back. And that was how they got their education. They would get graded on their assignments, and that's how this would happen. This National Radio School actually lasted until 2002. It got bought by McGraw-Hill in 1968. And it's interesting to note that these sort of very technical jobs like radio, advertising, periodicals, whose readerships have a natural demographic, right? You already have a readership that's inclined towards being interested in science and engineering. So it's kind of a natural fit that way. So yeah, there's a closer look. Like, oh, Bill, I'm glad you sent for that free lesson. Yeah, it's not a great ad, but there it is. The kind of readership also scientific developments in keeping with Bernbach's original mandate of fiction based on real life scientific progress. So starting in the 1930s, you start to get illustrations on the back of magazines with these kind of visions of the future. So this is from the March 1939 issue. This is an idea of like what a future submarine might look like. Which kind of like very, very bloated compared to like the long torpedo-like submarines we actually have. This is one of my favorites. This is from 1938. This is what they imagine an airplane would look like in 1938. This is what we would all fly on. So you can imagine in the good old days of 1988, we apparently were flying. We had staterooms. There was a handball court and a gym, which I find really fascinating. We also thought you go to New York to Paris in 10 hours, which is pretty funny because you can do it now in like what, 7? So this is kind of one of the I love to show this to students and they always get a kick out of it. So electrical professions, as I said, also become wave of the early 20th century future. There's one ad that notes specifically, this is the electrical age. This is from the Coyne Electrical School. This ad is from the August 1928 issue. The Coyne Electrical School was accelerated during World War II as there were more of a need for radio operators, radio engineers, radio mechanics. So the pulps are hoping to capitalize on that need of industry. Aviation, also a fun one. There's another campaign to grow a new industry. Aviation is the coming thing in 1928. And so the American School of Aviation, which has the middle ad there, is running a correspondence course in practical aeronautics. There were lessons on physics of flight, airplane construction, parts inspection, zeppelins, air law, all kinds of things. And the idea was in these things, you could take this correspondence course, and when you were done, you would be legitimately skilled to fly a plane. Even if these courses don't mandate that you get in a plane and fly. They're assuming that you can do all this work at home in your head and on paper, and then you become, it's very kind of inspiring. And just the last bit of ads is the chemicals, another growing industry, especially after World War I and World War II. Because again, they would send you a chemistry set, they'd send you kits, and you would do these, you do experiments sent to you, and you would send them back, and this would qualify you for jobs in the chemical industry. It's a growth industry, especially after World War I. This one is particularly relevant to Amazing Stories because the director of the American Chemical Institute was this guy on the left here, Thomas O'Connor Sloan. Sloan was a well-regarded scientist. He was an editor of Scientific American in the 1890s. He helped Gernsback in editing his early publications. And from 1929 to 1938, Sloan himself edited Amazing Stories, which is particularly interesting because I didn't know this until I started digging into this. Sloan, as the editor of a major science fiction magazine with a lot of stories about rocketry and space travel, himself did not believe space travel was actually scientifically possible. His belief was the acceleration needed to reach escape velocity would crush any astronaut who tried to escape the Earth. So publishing, it's just funny, publishing all these stories on rocketry, he himself did not believe that space travel was a possible thing. I just find that kind of a fun little bit of irony. And with that, that ends our little show. There's a few minutes left, I believe, for questions and answers. Unless Anna and Andrew have anything else to conclude with, we'll just jump to it. But I want to thank all of you for coming. And I do want to thank Andrew and Anna for bringing such beautiful, such brilliant observations to the talk today. And that's what I've got.
So, Jeremy, it's interesting you brought up Sloan there at the end, because one thing I wanted to comment on, and it sort of ties in with the Palmer stuff too. There's the pulps are a really good example in sort of the intellectual library space of like being critically analyzing your sources, right? It's primary source literacy, thinking about like, what is the document that I'm looking at? What does it represent? What is the context around it, right? Like sort of thinking broader about what's influencing this item that I have in my hands. And you always have to question, like, as I was going through and sort of diving into the Palmer stuff and some of the oddities, like there was always that thing in the back of my head where I was like, does Palmer actually really believe this stuff? Or is it just he had an eye for the thing that would garner sales, right? Like, is this just am I creating controversy just to drive more issues being sold, right? Like there's always that kind of question, especially with an editor, right? Because the money, right? You always want to follow the money. That's always a factor, especially in something like the pulp magazines. And so I think that, with the Sloan too, again, right? Like it's thinking about who was he, what did he think, what did he do? And like, how does that contrast with or compare with the content that he was publishing in the stories, right? And in the case of Palmer, I think it's pretty clear that he was off the deep end because he just did it forever. He never went away, and he really like got into it and was personally publishing, like reprinting some of these weird texts. So
the way the editors have that control is really interesting. Especially like the most famous example, right? John Campbell with Astounding, right? When he was one of the first proponents of Dianetics and started pushing it in the magazine and started pushing all these kind of more stories about psychic powers and things like that, which was not really that kind of drove. I know that ended up driving a lot of his traditional authors away. Like, no, we're doing science fiction, dude. So yeah. Francesca tells me that we are unfortunately out of time.
Out of time. So yeah, I want to ask Anna, do you have any concluding comments?
No, just thank you. I tried to answer as many questions as I could in the chat, so I think we're pretty well covered.
Yeah, so there are a lot of questions in the chat. Anna's done a great job answering, so we'll try, hopefully we can answer the rest via email. We have your contact information. We are unfortunately out of time, so no real time for more discussion. I did want to ask though if there's an interest in more talk about this topic, because we're actually thinking about having multiple talks about pulp magazines. So if you are interested, put it in the chat or feel free to contact us. And it looks like there's a lot of interest.
Yeah, we can do this for hours.
Oh yeah, there's so much more to say. And I just put, by the way, my email in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch with me directly, or Anna and Andrew, if you guys want to do that too. If you haven't already done it, just so you can contact us directly, because I'm sorry we couldn't. Tons of questions that we couldn't get to. I apologize for that, but yeah.
Yeah, people sent me links in the chat, and I just want to say I'm pretty leery of opening those. But if you want to email me directly, I'd be happy to take a look. I don't want anything weird to happen on the screen with like spam or anything.
I did look at the creepypasta website.
Oh yeah.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Jeremy, Andrew, and Anna, and thank you everybody for participating, and so many countries again. That was great. We also had Greece, so it's just like wonderful people from all over the world and other countries. So thank you again. It looks like there is more interest, so hopefully we'll have more talks. So thank you again, and it's almost a weekend, so enjoy your weekend, and thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.